The gas station sat in the middle of nowhere, a lone sentinel against the pitch-black void of the desert night. Its flickering fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt and rusting gas pumps. The sign atop the station had long since lost its letters, leaving only a skeletal frame that groaned softly in the wind. Kevin, a weary traveler on a cross-country road trip, pulled his aging sedan up to one of the pumps. His GPS had failed hours ago, leaving him to navigate by instinct and dwindling road signs. He hadn't seen another car or building for miles, and his gas gauge hovered precariously above empty. As he stepped out of the car, the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was oppressive, unnatural, as though the night itself held its breath. Even the wind seemed to die as he approached the pump. Kevin slid his credit card into the machine, but the screen blinked with an error message. Inside pay only. Cursing under his breath, he glanced at the small convenience store attached to the station. Its windows were grimy, obscuring the view inside, but a faint light glowed from within. He hesitated. Something about the place made his skin crawl, but the urgency of his situation left him no choice. He locked his car and headed inside. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the empty room. The store was as dilapidated as the exterior suggested. Shelves half-stocked with dusty cans and faded snack wrappers. A thick layer of grime coated the floor tiles, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something sour. Behind the counter stood a man who seemed to belong to the station as much as the peeling wallpaper. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He didn't greet Kevin, nor did he move, save for a slight twitch of his lips that might have been a smile or a grimace. "Pump 3, Kevin said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. The man's skeletal fingers closed over the bill, but he didn't ring it up. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze fixed on Kevin with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not tonight." Kevin forced a chuckle. "Well, I didn't exactly plan it. Just need some gas to get back on the road." The man didn't respond. Instead, he slid the bill into the register with excruciating slowness. Kevin waited, shifting uncomfortably under the man's stare. Finally, the pump outside beeped, signaling it was ready. Kevin mumbled a quick thanks and made his way back outside. The air felt heavier now, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. He fumbled with the nozzle, glancing nervously around. The darkness beyond the station seemed to pulse and shift, as if alive. As the gas flowed, Kevin's unease deepened. He thought he heard whispers. Faint, unintelligible voices carried on the wind. He turned, scanning the area, but saw nothing. The station remained eerily still. When the pump clicked off, Kevin hurriedly replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his car. Relief washed over him as the engine roared to life. But as he pulled back onto the highway, his headlights illuminated something in the rearview mirror. Movement. A shadowy figure darted from the edge of the station's light into the surrounding darkness. Kevin's pulse quickened. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the shadows, but the feeling of being watched refused to leave him. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between himself and the gas station. Miles passed, but the road remained empty and unchanging. No signs, no exits, just an endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the night. Kevin glanced at his GPS again, hoping it had recalibrated, but the screen remained blank. A sharp knock on the passenger window jolted him out of his thoughts. His heart leapt into his throat as he whipped his head around. The window was empty, but the knock came again, this time from the driver's side. Kevin slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. He peered out into the night, his breath fogging the glass. Nothing, just the oppressive darkness pressing against the car. Then the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. Panic set in as he fumbled with the gear shift, his hands shaking. Before he could move, the car's engine sputtered and died. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each one distinct yet impossible to understand. Kevin locked the doors, his eyes darting frantically around. He thought he saw shapes moving in the darkness, tall, spindly figures with glowing eyes that burned like embers. A sharp metallic scraping sound drew his attention to the hood of the car. Something was crawling across it, something not human. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body contorted in unnatural angles. It stopped inches from the windshield, its face, or what Kevin assumed was a face, pressed against the glass. Its eyes bored into his, and a jagged grin stretched across its featureless head. Kevin screamed, his hands slamming against the steering wheel. The creature didn't move, its grin widening as the whispers reached a fever pitch. Suddenly, the car's interior lights flickered, and the radio crackled to life, spewing static interspersed with faint, garbled words. "Join us," the voices whispered in unison. Kevin's vision blurred as the world seemed to tilt. His last coherent thought was of the gas station attendant's warning. Then, everything went black. When Kevin awoke, he was back at the gas station, sitting in his car. The pump was still in his hand, the tank half full. The station's lights buzzed faintly, and the desert night stretched endlessly around him. But something was different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. And in the rearview mirror, Kevin saw himself, still sitting in the driver's seat.
Story number 2.
The road twisted through an endless expanse of woods, the towering trees like skeletal sentinels guarding a forbidden realm. Rebecca squinted at the GPS, its faint glow the only light apart from her car's dim headlights. She'd been driving for hours, trying to shave time off her trip with a supposed shortcut. Now, deep in the wilderness with no cell signal, she was beginning to regret it. As her gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, relief swept over her when she spotted a faint neon glow in the distance. A gas station appeared like a mirage, its flickering open sign casting an eerie green hue onto the cracked pavement. The station looked ancient, its single pump weathered and leaning, the small convenience store behind it barely lit. She pulled up to the pump, her tires crunching on loose gravel. The station looked deserted. Not a single other car in sight, no sound but the soft hum of the overhead light. Rebecca stepped out of the car, shivering in the cold air. She grabbed the nozzle and tried to start the pump, but nothing happened. A faded sign on the pump read, "Pay inside first." Rebecca groaned, glancing at the store. The windows were smeared with grime, making it impossible to see inside. A lone fluorescent bulb buzzed weakly above the door. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. But her car wouldn't make it another mile. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. The shelves were sparsely stocked, most items coated in dust. The air was heavy with the smell of rot, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the corner made the silence even more oppressive. Behind the counter sat a man. At least, Rebecca thought it was a man. His face was obscured by shadows, and his skin was pale to the point of translucence. He wore an old, tattered uniform, the name tag scratched beyond recognition. His head moved slightly as she entered, though his eyes didn't seem to focus on her. "Pump 1, Rebecca said, her voice trembling slightly. She placed a $20 bill on the counter. The man didn't respond. He simply stared, unblinking. Rebecca hesitated, her unease growing. Pump 1? She repeated. Finally, he moved. His hand, unnaturally long and bony, reached out and took the bill. His lips parted slightly as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Rebecca turned quickly, eager to get back to her car. As she reached for the door, the man finally spoke. "You should hurry." She froze, her hand on the doorknob. "Excuse me?" His voice was hoarse, like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "You shouldn't linger. Not here. Not tonight." Rebecca's blood ran cold. She didn't respond, bolting out the door and back to her car. She started the pump, watching the numbers climb far too slowly. The forest around the station felt alive, the shadows between the trees shifting unnaturally. A cold breeze brushed past her, and for a moment she thought she heard a sound, a faint, guttural growl. Her eyes darted toward the woods, and that's when she saw them. Glowing eyes, pairs of them, peering out from the darkness. They were too high to belong to any animal she knew, and they didn't blink. Rebecca's hands shook as she gripped the pump, willing it to fill faster. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Something large was moving through the trees, heading straight for the station. The pump clicked off, and Rebecca didn't waste a second. She yanked the nozzle out, jumped into her car, and slammed the door. Her tires screeched as she sped off down the road, her heart pounding in her chest. But the relief was short-lived. In her rearview mirror, she saw something step out of the woods onto the road behind her. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted like the gnarled branches of the trees. Its glowing eyes burned into her, and its mouth opened into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, mismatched teeth. It started to run. Rebecca floored the gas pedal, her car shaking as it accelerated down the uneven road. She dared not look back again, the sound of her own ragged breathing mixing with the growing roar of whatever was chasing her. The road seemed endless, the trees on either side a suffocating tunnel. Then she saw it, a sign for the highway up ahead. If she could just reach it, she'd be safe. But as she approached the intersection, her headlights illuminated something that made her heart stop. The gas station. It stood there, exactly as she had left it, the flickering neon sign mocking her. She slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no!" The creature's growl erupted behind her, deafening now. She didn't have time to think. She threw the car into reverse, spinning it around to face the direction she'd come from. But the road wasn't there. Instead, the gas station stood in her path once again, its lights buzzing faintly. The man from the counter now stood outside, his face blank, his unnaturally long arms hanging at his sides. Rebecca screamed as the creature lunged from the darkness, its twisted limbs wrapping around her car. The last thing she saw before the windows shattered was the attendant, raising a single bony finger to his lips in a shushing motion. Then everything went black. When morning came, the gas station stood silent and empty. The car was gone. The forest was still. But if you listen closely, you might hear faint whispers on the wind, and if you're unlucky, a pair of glowing eyes watching from the shadows.
Story number 3.
The rain poured in relentless sheets, turning the lonely highway into a river of slick black asphalt. Angela tightened her grip on the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. Her GPS chirped, announcing a gas station just ahead, and relief washed over her. She was running low on gas, and the thought of being stranded in this storm was unbearable. The station appeared suddenly out of the gloom, like its dimly lit canopy glowing like a beacon. It was small, old-fashioned, and isolated, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. Angela shook off the thought as she pulled up to the pump, telling herself she was just tired. She stepped out of the car, the rain drenching her instantly, and tried to swipe her card. The screen blinked. "Pay inside." Groaning, she grabbed her coat and hurried into the small convenience store. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, the sound oddly muffled by the storm outside. The store was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly. Shelves lined with dusty products stretched toward the back, but the counter at the front was empty. "Hello?" Angela called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. No response. She leaned over the counter, peering into the shadowy back room. "Anyone here?" Still nothing. She tapped her fingers on the counter, debating whether to wait or just leave. That's when she noticed the faint footprints on the floor. They were wet, leading from the door she'd just come through and heading toward the far aisle. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen anyone outside, and she hadn't left those footprints. Swallowing her unease, she followed the trail. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the store, the dim light casting strange flickering shadows. The wet footprints ended abruptly in front of the refrigerated section. Angela froze. The glass doors of the refrigerators reflected her image, but something wasn't right. In the reflection, she saw herself standing there, and behind her a dark figure. She spun around, but the aisle was empty. Only the soft hum of the refrigerators filled the air. Her breath quickened. "Hello? Is someone here?" The bell above the door jingled again. Angela felt a rush of relief. Someone else had come in. But when she hurried back to the counter, the door was swinging shut, and the store was empty. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, grateful for the distraction, but her relief turned to dread when she saw the message. "Don't turn around." Angela's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone she was here. She glanced around, her eyes darting to every corner of the store, but she was still alone. Slowly, her hand tightened around her phone, and she made her way toward the door. The lights flickered. A deep, guttural noise echoed from somewhere in the store, low and animalistic. Angela's heart pounded as she reached the door and pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, but it was as if the door had been welded shut. The sound came again, closer this time. She spun around, her back pressed against the door. Her eyes darted wildly, scanning the aisles, the shadows, the flickering lights. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the store, shrouded in darkness, its form just barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching her. Angela's legs felt like jelly, but instinct took over. She bolted toward the counter, hoping to find a back exit. As she rounded the corner, the figure appeared again, impossibly close. Its face, or what she assumed was its face, was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. She screamed and stumbled back, tripping over a display of chips. The thing moved, not walking but gliding, its body unnaturally fluid. Angela scrambled to her feet and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ducked behind a shelf, her mind racing. The sound of wet footsteps echoed through the store. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming closer. Angela clapped a hand over her mouth, trying to stifle her breathing. She peeked through a gap in the shelves, but the thing was gone. Suddenly, the wet footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Angela's pulse hammered in her ears as she pressed herself against the shelf, willing herself to disappear. Then a raspy whisper broke the silence, coming from right behind her. "Why are you hiding?" She screamed and bolted, knocking over shelves in her panic. She sprinted toward the back of the store, where she spotted a door marked Exit. She threw herself at it, praying it would open, and to her relief, it did. She burst out into the rain-soaked night, her lungs burning. Angela didn't stop. She ran to her car, fumbling with her keys, and threw herself inside. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the lot, her tires skidding on the wet pavement. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, convinced she'd see those glowing eyes staring back at her. The gas station disappeared into the storm, and Angela kept driving, her hands shaking on the wheel. She didn't stop until she saw the lights of a town in the distance. Pulling into a diner parking lot, she finally allowed herself to breathe. But as she turned off the engine, something caught her eye. On the passenger seat, in a pool of rainwater, was a single, wet footprint.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the empty highway as Derek's beat-up pickup sputtered to a stop. He cursed under his breath, glancing at the gas gauge. Empty. Of course. He grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, swallowed by the darkness of the surrounding forest. In the distance, a faint light glimmered. A gas station. Relief flooded him as he grabbed his jacket and started walking. The cold bit at his skin, and the eerie silence made his footsteps sound unnaturally loud. The light grew closer, and soon the outline of the station came into view. It was old, almost decrepit. The paint on the sign was faded beyond recognition, and the single gas pump stood under a flickering overhead light. The convenience store behind it looked just as run down, its windows covered in grime. Derek hesitated, but the thought of spending the night stranded in the dark pushed him forward. The bell above the door jangled sharply as he stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic smell. The shelves were mostly empty, lined with dusty, expired products. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its dim light casting long shadows. Behind the counter stood a clerk. He was tall and thin, with greasy hair that clung to his pale forehead. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and his lips curled into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Car trouble?" the clerk asked, his voice low and raspy. "Yeah," Derek replied. "Ran out of gas. Need to fill up." The clerk nodded, but instead of moving, he just stared at Derek. It wasn't a friendly gaze, it was heavy, almost predatory. "Pump's self-serve," the clerk finally said. "But if I were you, I'd be quick about it." Derek frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The clerk's smile widened just enough to reveal yellowed teeth. "Night's not safe around here. Not for people like you." "People like me?" Derek asked, his irritation growing. But the clerk didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back, disappearing into the shadows of the back room. Derek shook his head and left, the bell above the door jingling again. He walked to the pump and started fueling up, his nerves prickling from the encounter. The cold air felt heavier now, and the surrounding forest seemed to lean closer, its shadows darker and more suffocating. A faint rustling noise broke the stillness. Derek froze, his hand gripping the nozzle tightly. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the snapping of branches. He scanned the tree line, but the gas station's dim light barely reached the edges of the forest. "Probably just an animal," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. But then he saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and gaunt. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped at the edge of the light, its face obscured by shadows, but Derek could feel its gaze locked on him. His breath hitched, and every instinct screamed at him to run. The pump clicked. signaling that the tank was full. Derek shoved the nozzle back into place and scrambled into his truck. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet from the truck. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes glowed faintly like twin embers burning in the dark. Derek slammed on the gas, the tires squealing as he sped away. The forest blurred past him, the truck's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. His heart pounded in his chest, and he couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure chasing him. But the road ahead offered no comfort. In the distance, he saw lights. A gas station. It was the same gas station. His hands tightened on the wheel as he passed it, refusing to stop. He glanced in the side mirror, and there it was again. The flickering light, the solitary pump, the grimy windows. It didn't make sense. He'd been driving straight, and yet the rustling noise returned, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy landing on the roof of the truck. Derek's chest tightened as the vehicle shook under the weight. He dared not look up, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. A loud scraping sound tore through the air, metal on metal, as if claws were dragging across the roof. The truck swerved as Derek struggled to keep control, his breathing ragged. Then, something slammed against the windshield. Derek screamed as the face of the figure pressed against the glass, its glowing eyes staring directly into his. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and an otherworldly shriek filled the air. The truck spun off the road, crashing into a ditch. Derek's head slammed against the steering wheel, and darkness swallowed him. When he came to, he was back at the gas station. His truck sat parked by the pump, the tank still empty. The station looked the same, but the forest was silent, unnervingly still. Derek stumbled out of the truck, his head pounding. The clerk stood outside the store, his yellowed grin wider than before. "Still here?" the clerk asked, his tone mocking. "You can't leave, you know. Not until it lets you." Derek's blood ran cold as the rustling noise started again, this time closer. The clerk chuckled, stepping back into the store and locking the door behind him. And then from the forest, they came. Figures, dozens of them, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding the station. The last thing Derek heard before the lights went out was the sound of the bell above the door and a voice whispering, "You were warned."
Story number 5.
The two-lane road stretched endlessly through the barren desert, the only light coming from Lauren's headlights, and the stars scattered across the black sky. She had been driving for hours, chasing the dim hope of reaching a motel before exhaustion claimed her. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty, and the nearest town was still miles away. Then she saw it. A gas station. It stood alone, surrounded by miles of nothingness, its faded sign flickering weakly in the wind. The station's single pump glinted under a dim bulb, and the small building next to it seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. Lauren pulled in, her tires crunching on gravel. The place looked abandoned, but the sign on the door read, "Open." She grabbed her wallet and stepped out of the car, the desert wind biting against her skin. The pump was old, one of those manual ones with a lever you had to crank. She tried to get it working, but nothing happened. A yellowed sticker on the side read, "Pay inside." Sighing, she glanced at the station. The windows were filthy, making it impossible to see inside. As she pushed open the door, a bell chimed overhead. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The shelves were lined with outdated products, their labels faded and curling. Behind the counter sat an old man. His skin was leathery and thin, stretched too tightly over his face. His eyes were sunken but alert, tracking her as she approached. "Need gas," Lauren said, placing a $20 bill on the counter. The man didn't move. He just stared at her with an unsettling stillness. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice gravelly and uneven. "You're driving through tonight?" he asked. "Yeah," Lauren replied, confused. "Why?" He shook his head slowly as if pitying her. "You don't want to be on this road after midnight." Her stomach tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out an ancient-looking key, handing it to her. "Pump's locked. You'll need this." Lauren hesitated, but she took the key and left. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind her. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying a low, mournful howl. She unlocked the pump and began fueling, and her eyes darting nervously to the empty highway and the dark desert beyond. As the tank filled, a sound broke the silence. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't the wind this time. It came from somewhere near the edge of the lot. Lauren froze, her hand tightening on the nozzle. She scanned the darkness, her heart pounding. Then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the station's light, its outline barely visible. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to twitch and shudder as it moved. The growl came again, louder this time, and the figure took a step closer. Lauren's breath hitched. She yanked the nozzle out of her car, spilling gas in her haste, and climbed back into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the lot, her tires spitting gravel behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The station was disappearing into the distance, but so was the figure, running after her. And it was fast, too fast. Her foot slammed on the gas, the needle climbing past 80 miles per hour. But when she looked back again, the thing was still there, its limbs moving in a horrifying, unnatural rhythm as it chased her down the highway. Its face was just a blur, but its eyes, two pinpricks of glowing white, were locked on her. Lauren's pulse thundered in her ears. She kept driving, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The road stretched on endlessly, the desert around her a void. Then, far ahead, she saw it, another gas station. Her heart sank. It looked exactly the same as the one she had just left. She roared past it, refusing to stop, but as she looked in her mirror, her blood turned cold. The gas station was there again, just behind her, its flickering sign mocking her. And the thing, it wasn't behind her anymore. It was in the road. Lauren screamed as the figure appeared directly in her path, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. She yanked the wheel hard, her car skidding off the road and slamming into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she forced herself to move, her only thought being to escape. She crawled out of the car, her legs shaky, and looked around. The highway was gone. So was the ditch. She was back at the gas station, her car perfectly parked by the pump, the engine silent. The bell above the door jingled. Lauren turned slowly, her heart racing. The old man stood in the doorway, his leathery face split by a crooked smile. "I told you," he said, his voice low and dripping with malice. "You shouldn't be out here after midnight." Behind him, the shadows shifted. Dozens of shapes emerged, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. They surrounded the station, their twisted limbs clawing at the ground as they crept closer. Lauren stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The old man's smile widened as he stepped aside, letting the creatures pour into the light. The last thing she saw was a sea of glowing eyes and jagged teeth, and the old man, standing at the counter, ringing up her purchase like it was just another transaction.
Story number 6.
The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. as Mason drove down the deserted highway. His eyelids were heavy, the steady hum of his engine lulling him toward dangerous drowsiness. He promised himself he'd stop at the first gas station he saw, fill up the tank, and grab a coffee. As if summoned by his thoughts, a gas station appeared ahead, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Roy's Gas and Convenience. The building looked worn, its once bright paint peeling, and the canopy over the pump sagged slightly. But it was open, and that was all Mason cared about. He pulled up to the pump, stepping out into the crisp night air. The station was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional chirp of insects and the faint rustle of wind. He tried his credit card at the pump, but the machine displayed an error message. "Please pay inside." Rolling his eyes, Mason made his way toward the store. The bell above the door gave a harsh jingle as he entered. The air inside was stale, carrying an odd mix of disinfectant and something metallic. The store was mostly empty. Rows of dusty shelves and a cooler humming in the corner. Behind the counter sat a clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a gaunt face. He didn't greet Mason, didn't even look up from the small TV set he was watching. "I need to pay for gas," Mason said, placing a 20 on the counter. The clerk finally turned his head. His eyes were strange, dark and flat like two bottomless pits. Mason felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "You're out late," the clerk said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," Mason replied, forcing a casual tone. "Long drive ahead." The clerk's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it was more unsettling than friendly. "Pump's ready. Be careful out there." Mason nodded, eager to leave the unsettling man behind. He filled up his tank quickly, his nerves on edge. As he replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his car, he glanced at the store. The clerk was standing in the window now, staring at him, motionless. Mason hit the gas and sped off. The highway stretched on, dark and endless. He turned on the radio to break the oppressive silence, but every station was static. Annoyed, he turned it off and kept driving. A few miles down the road, he noticed something in the distance, another gas station. His stomach sank. It was the same one, Roy's Gas and Convenience. Mason slowed as he passed it, staring in disbelief. The pumps, the sagging canopy, even the flickering neon sign, it was identical. He kept driving, refusing to stop this time. The highway stretched on again, but a gnawing unease settled over him. The landscape looked the same as before. He checked the time. It was still 11:47 p.m. And then he saw it again. Roy's Gas and Convenience. His hands tightened on the wheel. This couldn't be happening. He sped past the station, glancing in his rearview mirror. The neon sign flickered ominously, growing smaller until it disappeared. But a minute later, it was back. This time, it wasn't identical. It was worse. The lights were dimmer, and the sign was broken, hanging by a single wire. The windows of the store were shattered, and dark stains smeared the walls. Mason's pulse quickened. He slammed on the gas, the car roaring forward. The radio turned on by itself, blasting static. Mason jumped, his hand darting to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't move. Through the static, a voice whispered, "You can't run." Panicking, Mason glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. A figure sat in his back seat. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpoints of pale light. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at him. Mason swerved, the car skidding onto the shoulder. He jumped out, heart pounding, and looked inside. The back seat was empty. He stood there, gasping for breath, the highway eerily silent around him. When he looked up, his stomach dropped. The gas station was ahead of him again, but this time there were no lights at all. The pumps were rusted, the canopy collapsed. The store was dark, its windows boarded up. Against all logic, Mason found himself walking toward it. His feet moved on their own, dragging him closer. The bell above the door jangled weakly as he stepped inside. The clerk was there, but he wasn't watching TV anymore. He stood behind the counter, grinning widely. His eyes were no longer dark. They were glowing, just like the figures in the car. "Welcome back," the clerk said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "We've been waiting for you." Mason turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners began to move. They weren't shadows. Figures emerged, their bodies twisted and wrong, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They surrounded Mason, their mouths opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The clerk's grin widened as he stepped out from behind the counter. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. The last thing Mason saw was the flickering neon sign outside. It no longer said Roy's Gas and Convenience. It simply read, "Nowhere."
Story number 7.
The rain came down in relentless sheets, hammering against Leah's windshield as she squinted to see the road ahead. The highway was desolate, the dark forest on either side looking like jagged teeth closing in. She'd been driving for hours, her gas gauge perilously close to empty. Relief washed over her when she spotted the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. She pulled into the station, her tires sloshing through puddles. The building was old and weathered, its paint peeling, and the fluorescent lights above the pumps buzzed and flickered erratically. The sign above the station read, "Last Stop Gas." Leah stepped out of her car, clutching her jacket tightly against the cold rain. She glanced around. There was no one else in sight. No other cars, no attendants, nothing. The silence, apart from the rain, was unnerving. The pump didn't accept her card. A faded sign taped to the machine read, "Pay inside." With a sigh, Leah trudged toward the store. The bell above the door gave a sharp, metallic ring as she entered. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent tubes overhead buzzing with an almost angry intensity. The shelves were sparsely stocked, holding dusty cans of soup, faded boxes of cereal, and snacks that looked years past their expiration date. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Behind the counter stood the clerk, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and piercing eyes that seemed too large for his gaunt face. He smiled at Leah, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was too wide, too forced. "Help you with something?" he asked, his voice raspy and uneven. Just need to pay for gas, Leah said, pulling a 20 from her wallet and placing it on the counter. The clerk didn't take the money right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Late to be traveling this road, step, he said. Leah forced a polite smile, uneasy under his gaze. Yeah, well, I'm just passing through. Long drive ahead. The clerk nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Be careful out there, he said, his tone oddly ominous. Leah didn't respond. She left the store quickly, the bells jingle following her out into the rain. She pumped the gas as fast as she could, her hands trembling slightly. As she climbed back into her car, she glanced back at the store. The clerk was still standing at the counter, staring at her through the rain-speckled glass. Shaking off her unease, she started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched on endlessly, the rain creating a constant haze. She kept her eyes on the road, but something felt wrong. The trees seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches clawing at the edges of the asphalt. Then she saw it. Another gas station. Her stomach dropped. It was the same station. The peeling paint, the flickering sign, the buzzing lights. Last stop, gas. No, she whispered to herself, gripping the wheel tighter. This isn't possible. She sped past it, refusing to stop, her pulse pounding in her ears. But the road seemed to loop, an endless stretch of black asphalt winding through the same eerie forest. And then she saw it again. The station appeared ahead, but this time it looked different. The lights were dimmer, the windows cracked and smeared with something dark. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the words, "Last stop gas," flickered, struggling to stay lit. Leah's hands shook as she drove past, her foot pressing harder on the gas. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her radio, which had been silent, crackled suddenly. A voice came through, faint and distorted, barely audible over the static. "Turn back," it whispered. Leah's chest tightened. She turned the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. "Turn back," it said again, louder this time. She glanced in the rearview mirror and screamed. A figure sat in the back seat. Its face was pale and featureless, like a mannequin's, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The figure raised a hand, its long, spindly fingers tapping against the glass separating the front seats. Leah swerved wildly, the car veering off the road and into the ditch. She gasped for air, her heart hammering, and when she looked back, the figure was gone. The rain had stopped. Stepping out of the car, Leah found herself back at the gas station. Only now it was worse. The pumps were rusted, the building barely standing. The neon sign flickered weakly, its letters rearranged to read, "Stop, last gas." The clerk stood outside, his wide smile now impossibly large, stretching from ear to ear. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Behind him, figures began to emerge from the shadows of the forest. Their bodies were grotesque, hunched and twisted, their eyes glowing like embers. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding her. Leah stumbled backward, her legs refusing to work properly. The clerk stepped closer, his movements smooth and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You've already made your last stop," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. The figures closed in, their glowing eyes the last thing Leah saw before the world went dark.
Story number 8.
The storm rolled in faster than anyone could have predicted. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, leaving the narrow road bathed in darkness. Kevin's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his GPS flickering erratically. He'd been on the road for hours, trying to make it to his sister's cabin before the weather turned worse. But now his gas gauge was dangerously low, the needle hovering just above empty. He cursed under his breath, scanning the horizon for any sign of civilization. Finally, through the sheets of rain, he spotted it. A gas station. Its lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the wet pavement. The sign above the station read, "Hollow Pines Gas, open 24 hours. Relieved, Kevin pulled in and parked by the nearest pump. The station looked old and decrepit, the windows smudged with grime, and the roof sagging slightly under years of wear. A dim bulb above the pumps buzzed and cast an unnatural yellow glow. Kevin stepped out, shivering as the cold rain soaked through his jacket. He tried his card at the pump, but the machine beeped loudly, displaying the message, "See attendant inside." With a groan, he grabbed his wallet and headed toward the small building. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and a bell jingled overhead. The interior was unnervingly quiet. Rows of dusty shelves held an assortment of outdated snacks and drinks. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Behind the counter sat a man, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a baseball cap. His shoulders were hunched, and he appeared to be scribbling something on a notepad. "Hey," Kevin called, his voice echoing slightly in the empty store. The man didn't look up. "Pump's not working. I need to pay for gas." The clerk slowly raised his head, revealing a pale, expressionless face. His eyes were too wide, unblinking, and they seemed to pierce right through Kevin. "How far are you headed?" the clerk asked, his voice low and hoarse. Kevin hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Just passing through. My sister's place, about an hour up the road." The clerk stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "You shouldn't be driving tonight?" "Yeah, well, I don't have much of a choice," Kevin replied, forcing a chuckle. "How much for a full tank?" The clerk tilted his head slightly as if confused by the question. Then, without a word, he reached under the counter and slid a key across to Kevin. "What's this for?" "The pump," the clerk said simply. Kevin frowned but took the key, eager to get back on the road. As he turned to leave, the clerk called out behind him, "Don't stop for anyone." Kevin paused, his stomach tightening. "What?" "On this road," the clerk said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what you see, don't stop for anyone." The words sent a chill down Kevin's spine, but he shook it off and walked out into the rain. He unlocked the pump, filled his tank as quickly as possible, and climbed back into his car. As he pulled out onto the road, he glanced back at the station. Through the rain, he could see the clerk standing in the window, watching him. The road ahead was empty, the forest pressing in on either side. The storm seemed to grow worse, the rain pounding harder, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Kevin focused on the road, the clerk's warning echoing in his mind. 20 minutes later, he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Kevin slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The figure didn't move, illuminated only by his headlights. It was a woman, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands over her face. She wore a tattered dress, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Kevin rolled down his window slightly, rain splattering his face. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving. Against his better judgment, Kevin opened the door and stepped out. "Hey, do you need help?" As he approached, the woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken. And then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. Kevin stumbled back, his heart pounding. The woman took a step toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her smile grew wider, her teeth sharp and glinting in the rain. Kevin turned and sprinted back to his car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The woman was closer now, her face inches from the driver's side window, her grin never faltering. He floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was still there, standing in the middle of the road, but then she wasn't. Kevin's breath caught as he heard a faint tapping. It was coming from the back seat. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he turned his head. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her wide grin reflecting in the rearview mirror. "You didn't stop," she whispered, her voice distorted and guttural. Kevin screamed as the car veered off the road. The last thing he saw was the forest rushing toward him, and her laughter echoing in his ears. When the authorities found the car the next day, it was empty. No sign of Kevin, no sign of anyone. But the gas station clerk? He simply smiled when asked about it. "Another one," he muttered to himself, scribbling in his notepad.
Story number 9.
The night was unnervingly quiet as Sarah drove down the lonely, winding road through the mountains. Her headlights cut through the darkness, but beyond the beams of light, the world seemed to vanish into a black void. Her phone had lost service hours ago, and the only sound was the hum of her engine and the occasional rustle of the wind against the car. Her gas gauge blinked, the low fuel warning glowing ominously on the dashboard. She cursed under her breath. It had been miles since she'd seen any signs of civilization, and the thought of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere sent a chill down her spine. As if the universe had heard her panic, a gas station appeared around the bend, its lights flickering weakly in the distance. It stood alone, surrounded by thick woods. The sign above the pumps read, "Birchwood Fuel." in peeling white letters, and a handwritten notice hung beneath, "Self-service." The place looked abandoned. The windows of the small convenience store were clouded with grime, and weeds pushed up through cracks in the pavement. But Sarah had no other option. She pulled up to the pump and got out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. The pump was ancient, the kind that required manual operation. She tried her card, but the machine displayed an error message, "Pay inside." She sighed and walked toward the store. The bell above the door gave a hollow clang as she stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. Dust covered everything, the shelves, the floor, even the counter. Rows of canned goods and snacks lined the shelves, but they looked decades old, their labels faded and peeling. Behind the counter sat an old man. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken into his skull. He didn't look up as Sarah approached, just stared at the counter as if lost in thought. "Hi," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. "The pump's not working. Can I pay here?" The man didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he raised his head. His eyes were cloudy, almost white, and when he spoke, his voice was raspy and distant, as if coming from far away. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to a small sign on the counter that read, "Pay cash only." Sarah fumbled in her wallet and placed a 20 on the counter. The man's hand moved slowly, his fingers curling around the bill as though it weighed a ton. He slid a key toward her without another word. "What's this for?" she asked. "The pump," he whispered, "and the bathroom, if you need it." "I'm fine, thanks," she replied quickly, unnerved by the way he was staring past her as though looking at something just over her shoulder. She turned to leave, but stopped when the man spoke again. "Don't go into the woods," he said. His voice was firmer now, more urgent. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." Sarah nodded, not wanting to engage further. She left the store, the door creaking shut behind her. As she walked back to her car, she glanced at the woods beyond the station. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. She unlocked the pump and began filling her tank. The sound of gas rushing into the car was oddly comforting, breaking the oppressive silence of the night, but then she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. A voice. "Help me," it whispered. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. She looked around, but the station was empty. The woods were still, shrouded in darkness. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading. It seemed to be coming from the woods. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She wanted to ignore it, to get back in her car and drive away, but something compelled her to take a step toward the trees. Her curiosity warred with her fear, and she stopped at the edge of the woods, peering into the shadows. "Is someone there?" she asked. The voice came again, closer now. "Please help me, I'm lost." Sarah's skin prickled. The voice sounded wrong, too perfect, too even, as though it were being played from a recording. And then she saw something. A figure, just barely visible between the trees. It was a woman, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. She stood motionless, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly to the side. Sarah took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to leave. She turned toward her car, but as she did, she heard the crunch of leaves behind her. She spun around. The woman was closer now, standing at the edge of the woods. Her hair still obscured her face, but Sarah could feel her gaze, cold and piercing. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered, backing away. "I can't help you." The woman tilted her head further, an unnatural, jerky motion, and then she smiled. It was wide, too wide, stretching her lips to the point of tearing. Her teeth were sharp, jagged, glinting in the faint light from the gas station. Sarah bolted to her car, her hands fumbling as she yanked open the door and jumped inside. She locked the doors and started the engine, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The woman was standing in front of the car now, her head cocked at an impossible angle, that horrifying smile still plastered across her face. Sarah slammed her foot on the gas. The car lurched forward and the figure disappeared beneath the wheels. But when Sarah looked in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. Her relief was short-lived. As she sped down the highway, she heard a faint sound coming from the back seat. A whisper. "Help me." Sarah glanced in the mirror and froze. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her face inches from Sarah's. Her grin stretched impossibly wide, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The last thing Sarah heard was her own scream, echoing into the endless night. Her car was found abandoned the next morning, parked neatly by the side of the road. The tank was full. But of Sarah there was no sign, only a set of wet footprints leading back toward the woods.
Story number 10.
The highway stretched endlessly into the night, an inky ribbon lit only by the pale glow of a crescent moon. Jackson's car hummed along the desolate stretch, the radio crackling with static as he fiddled with the dial. His GPS had taken him on this lonely route to avoid construction, and now he found himself driving through miles of darkness, the nearest town a distant memory. The gas gauge blinked ominously, the needle hovering dangerously close to E. Relief came in the form of a flickering neon sign ahead. Eddie's Gas and Rest, open 24/7. The station sat alone, a beacon of dim light in the sea of shadows, its red and green neon struggling to pierce the oppressive darkness. Jackson pulled into the lot. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. The building itself looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Cracked windows, peeling paint, and a sagging roof that seemed to bow under the weight of time. A lone gas pump stood sentinel in front, its metal corroded and nozzle dangling like a forgotten limb. Creepy, Jackson muttered, stepping out of his car. The air was colder than it should have been for a summer night, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of rust. Or was it blood? He shivered and began pumping gas, glancing toward the station's glass door. Inside, the faint outline of a figure loomed. The clerk, he assumed. After a few uneasy moments, the pump clicked off, and Jackson capped the tank. As he approached the station to pay, the shadowy figure moved closer to the door. It was a man, rail-thin, wearing a greasy cap that obscured much of his face. His eyes, however, were sharp and glassy, almost too wide, as if he hadn't blinked in hours. "Need anything else?" the man asked when Jackson entered. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against metal. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mildew, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead casting long, unnatural shadows. "No, just gas," Jackson replied, sliding a 20 across the counter. The man didn't take the money. Instead, he leaned forward, his cracked lips twitching into what could barely pass for a smile. "Not a lot of folks stop by here, especially not at this hour." Jackson forced a chuckle. "Yeah, I can see why. Kind of out of the way." The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Out of the way is good. Means no one hears the screams." Jackson froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Before he could respond, the man's head jerked toward the window, his expression snapping to one of alarm. "You didn't come here alone, did you?" "What?" Jackson turned to look outside, but all he saw was his car, parked under the dim halo of the gas pump light. "You shouldn't stay long," the man hissed, his earlier demeanor evaporating. "They don't like it when people linger." "Who's they?" Jackson asked, his voice tightening. The man didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the money off the counter and shoved it into the register. "Get back in your car and leave. Now." Jackson didn't argue. The man's sudden urgency was contagious, and a cold dread was beginning to settle in his gut. He pushed open the door, the rusty hinges screaming into the night. As he walked toward his car, a faint movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. In the shadows beyond the station, something stirred. It wasn't the wind or the sway of trees. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost predatory. Jackson quickened his pace, his heart pounding as he reached for his door handle. That's when he saw them. Figures, pale and emaciated, stepping into the weak light of the gas station lot. Their eyes were empty pits, their mouths stretched into gaping voids that didn't match the low, guttural moaning emanating from them. There were 4 of them, their movements jerky and unnatural as they closed in. Jackson fumbled with his keys, panic choking his thoughts. He threw the door open, diving inside just as the first figure lunged, its skeletal fingers clawing at the air where he'd been standing moments ago. He slammed the door shut, the car's interior suddenly feeling far too fragile, far too exposed. The creatures circled the car, their hollow eyes locked on him. One pressed its face to the driver's side window, the glass fogging as it exhaled a breath that smelled of rot. Jackson turned the key and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal. The tires squealed as the car lurched forward, the figures receding into the darkness. But as he sped down the highway, Jackson glanced in his rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The neon sign of Eddie's Gas and Rest was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of trees. Worse, in the dim red glow of his taillights, he could still see them. The pale figures, running impossibly fast, their hollow eyes fixed on his car. Jackson pressed harder on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 80. The figures didn't falter. Their movements became more erratic, limbs bending at impossible angles, their guttural moans rising into a cacophony that filled the night. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they stopped. Jackson didn't dare slow down, though. He drove until the gas gauge blinked again, his heart still racing. Hours later, he finally reached a town, pulling into a brightly lit diner parking lot. He stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth as his mind raced to process what had just happened. The waitress approached, a kind smile on her face. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," Jackson muttered, rubbing his temples. She nodded, placing a menu in front of him. "Where are you coming from?" "Some gas station off the highway. Eddie's or something." The waitress froze, her smile fading. "Eddie's? Yeah, why?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Eddie's burned down 10 years ago. No one's been out there since." Jackson felt the blood drain from his face. He turned to look out the diner's window, half expecting to see the figures waiting for him in the shadows. But the lot was empty.